Hi, I'm Claudia Goldin, Harvard. So my presentation today is about women's rights in the US after suffrage. So when did women's rights change in the US? How did they change? Why did they change? So women's rights, and click on the side, this one. No, this one. Oh, there it is. Okay. We met. In an extraordinarily brief period of time, as you're going to see, considerable legislation was passed and various judicial decisions bolstered the laws. But the passage of some legislation reinvigorated an anti-feminist traditionalist movement that is with us today. Although women's rights are more secured today, the causal impact on earnings and promotion and other aspects of society and the economy has been difficult to demonstrate. Women's rights mean that the legal to a woman's own body. I will talk mainly about the expansion on women's earnings and promotion and their educational attainment. Betsy Stevenson's work on women's sports and Martha Bailey's on relative earnings at the bottom of the distribution are two exceptions. I will first tell the fascinating story about why women won, and then I'm going to discuss how women won. Civil rights and women's rights in 1964, however, civil rights and women's rights came together and a national women's rights movement emerged soon thereafter. I'm not quite certain why this keeps on changing without my changing it, but we'll just keep it. Even if their husbands could support them, and that women should be more politically active, and that a woman could be president. And you'll see those numbers soon. But it took a far longer time for a majority to agree that women should have an equal role in industry, business, and government. By the 1970s, after considerable legislation regarding women's rights had been passed, women would deeply in this manner. When women read the title of my paper, they come up to me and explain, "We won? Really? You gotta be joking." Pregnant, for having children, or for capable of having children. They were denied credit and mortgages They had to use their husband's name on credit cards. They were treated differently than identical men by the IRS, the Social Security system, and the retirement rules of the federal government and the military. They had jobs that were advertised separately from those of men. They had restrictions on their work hours, types of jobs, conditions of jobs. They were harassed sexually as if it was normal behavior. I did this slide. Yes, I was called for jury duty. Despite these glaring facts that women were not treated consider this engram giving an index of the counts of books in the Google American English corpus that use the phrase racial discrimination at least once. Although, as you can see, it spikes in 1948 with the desegregation of the armed forces, it reaches a new plateau with the civil rights movement in 1958. And now for the same, for movement in the US. What was the road from an economy and a society in which women were legally going to go through the period of suffrage? I need to start in 1908 with the landmark Muller versus Oregon case. And that is the case that begins the legality of laws that protected women. These were championed by progressives like Louis Brandeis, shown here, to get a foot in the door for the union movement and to constrain employers through laws that would have been illegal under the Lochner decision because these laws restricted the right of labor work hours, types of work that women could do, the amounts that could be lifted, the necessity for chairs and were supported by progressives, Democrats, and unions as necessary protections. Republicans, on the other hand, in business interests, oppose them. And you will see this back and forth between the right and the left on these laws. That would soon change. So this would soon change. An important and influential commission on women's status was appointed by John Kennedy in 1961. Called for the passage of the Equal Pay Act, which occurred in 1963, right after it in the Fifth Amendments to be used on account of sex. They had only been used on account of race, and that's the Equal Protection Clause. And they would soon, in 1971, be used on account of sex. And that was a famous case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the lawyer for. However, the commission did not support the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, I'm going to have to slightly deviate for a minute because for those of you who remember, a lot happened in the 1960s, okay? And for those who don't remember, let me tell you, a lot happened in the 1960s. And it's going to impact, I will not go through all of the war movement all coming to a head at the same time. Now, this is a picture of the largest US demonstration in American history ever. In November of 1969, it was the March on the Pentagon. You will look at this picture and it's an absolute sea of faces. But if I look really closely, I see me, okay? Unfortunately, the icon for me, which looked like me in a Mac, does not look like me in this. So it's the revenge, okay? Okay, I was there, okay. Both of these gave women organizing talents and demonstrated that their issues were not being discussed. They learned the word oppression. And a more local grassroots movement, the women's liberation movement. Now, let me go back to the main timeline, and things there are going to be a bit complicated, but it's going to be resolved. And I have no idea what that dinosaur is doing down there. Okay, the highly contentious Civil Rights Act was part of the Kennedy administration's agenda, but it was stalled. And after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ pushed it forward. However, 2 days before the Civil Rights Amendment, Civil Rights Act was voted on, the word sex was added to Title VII. And Title VII is the title that deals with employment. And it was added by someone named probably it was added as a bit of a joke to defeat it. However, it didn't become a joke because women in the House wanted to add it. And in some sense, he may have been won over by them at some point. Representative Martha Griffiths noted that if the act passed, then Black women would be protected at work and white women wouldn't be protected at work. And so therefore, we should add the word sex because then white women also would be protected at work. That sort of was the reasoning. I explore in the paper, in fact, whether that reasoning had an impact on white men's views of women in the 10 states that were constrained by the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And the answer is established as the enforcing agency, but as soon as it was funded, the commissioners decided to take no action on account of sex. In fact, The commissioner himself mocked that and said, "We are not a sex commission, we are a race commission." And that led to the formation of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and now pushed for the passage of the ERA and for real equality, and supported ending protective legislation. As I said, Republicans and business interests wanted the ERA. The ERA was on the Republican platform ever since the 1940s. And they wanted the ERA to end protections. Unions were against it. Once again, we have this odd flip of progressives Title VII, almost immediately in 1968, essentially ended protective legislation, and the ERA passed overwhelmingly in 1972. In its first year, 30 states ratified it. Plus, surprise, surprise, in January of 1973, the Supreme Court suddenly decided Roe v. Wade. What big wins for the women's rights movement. But with something to attack, the Stop ERA movement began, and the pro-life movement was reinvigorated, and the ERA died. Since 1971, a ton of other women's rights legislation was passed. Title IX, the EO Act, which enabled the EOC to pursue cases Supreme Court case that essentially said women cannot be excluded from juries. And in 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed as an amendment to Title VII, and so on and so forth. Now, I compiled what historians and legal scholars have determined to be the most important moments critical moments in women's rights history. And these include legislation, judicial decisions, major events, turning points, prominent individuals, and so on. And I aggregated these in 5-year units in quinquennia. And as you can see, almost half of them occur between 1963 and 1973 in a very brief period of time. I put them into 4 categories. Across these categories. Now, one of the issues in looking at this is that each of these is being treated as a single piece of information, even though some of them affected millions of people and some of them affected tens of thousands of people. In addition, each of them is put when it passed and when it occurred, rather than what happened over time. And it's almost impossible to do it what one might think of as the right way, who was impacted by each of these. But just for the heck of it, I wanted to see how this evolved over time for one of them. And so I took the Title VII and the word sex, and I saw how many hits I got in the New York Times. And as you can see, Title VII, not for those of you who don't know what that means, it's the bona fide occupational qualification, which is the loophole in Title VII credit discrimination. In the 1980s, the cases concern insurance and pensions and sexual harassment and some class action suits. And then later on, there's a spate of cases trying to figure out what exactly sexual harassment is. It's absolutely amazing to read these cases that what looks to us like sexual harassment did not look like sexual harassment to justices, okay? So it looks like it rises and then falls. However, it has increased once again with a series of cases and discussion on sexual preference. Now, of the anti-feminist movement in terms of a very, very simple model. Okay. So underlying this model, this framework, is the notion that women are difficult to organize. We're not difficult, okay? We're difficult because we're all over the place. We're in every family, we're in every zip code, we're in every income class, religion, race, ethnicity. Women, unless there's an organization, don't really see that much can be done. An organization appears and they have a means to do something. I'm going to assume in this very simple model that individuals all have one unit of time in each period, and they can use that for leisure. They could work for a group that stands for equality, and equality means equal to men, no protections, or they could work for something that I'm going to call protection. Let's call the first group feminists, for whom equality with men is the ultimate, and the other traditionalists, for whom protection of various sorts is valued. The two groups initially have latent demands, and they get expressed when an organization is formed. So this is the equality PDF, and we could have a very, very large group in the middle for whom it's, I shouldn't say the middle here because this is really the zero line. At E sub 0, you could have a very, very large group who don't care at all, but this is a group for whom their unit of time. So each feminist, as I said, has some amount. So let's say that the ERA is passed, and that's equal to that point over there. Then it's the case that individuals between E0 and ERA will now leave the movement, not participate in the movement, and the movement will become dominated by a more radical group. So that's one of the implications of a very simple framework like this. In addition, there's people on the other side. Now, I don't want you to think that the other side is over here. It means that it's going in a negative direction. I just drew it this way. So this is the PDF for the other group, so that it wasn't on top of the other one. So it's just a mirror. Does not exceed that. As more women are employed and as they encounter discrimination and harassment in the workplace, the demand for equality will increase, the demand for protection will probably decrease. And I'm going to sort of come back to the implications of this model later. I now turn to what the nation's people, men, women, younger and older. I have 4 groups here, okay? Younger is 20 to 34, sorry. Yeah.
Claudia, before you go on to that, I was just a little puzzled by how the labeling of these two movement gets heated up in the crucial period are the left, right? I mean,
right.
many of them, they're not traditional, huh? They're the labor movement.
That's right. They're working class women. In fact, when NOW is formed, the battles in NOW were between the union people, right?
And in the ACLU and all these organizations
Right.
at that time. And so they only become traditionalists in the late 20th century. And people like Polly Murray,
Right.
you know, who really were
That's
against
right.
the ERA to begin with,
That's
because they had other,
Right.
but she's really an egalitarian. So how, if you're doing this over the long period of time, how do those labels interact with, you know, really the shifting composition of people who take these positions?
So I'm going to think about that as sort of post Title VII. So when equality, and when some of the union people and much of the left and much of there's still dissension, and it's still going to be the case. You're absolutely right that some of these traditionalists are not going to be the people that we usually think of here as the quote they're not the Phyllis Schlafly's, but they're not on board. They're just not there. Okay, they really want a set of protections, and these protections are not just in the workplace, which they really do want. I mean, the debate over pregnancy is one of the largest, most contentious. You know, do we want equality, or do we want as women to be different? I mean, that remained the case into the 1990s. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that this isn't a very, very clear divide into the people. Women who want protections, not just in employment, but in family, in alimony, in retirement, et cetera. Yeah, I think that's right. So what I want to do now is turn my attention to what the nation's people, the men, women, the younger, the older. So remember, the younger is 20 to 34 and the older is 35 to 64, and anyone older than that I've thrown out. So we want to see what they thought of women's roles and women's rights. So in some cases, so this is all this public opinion data that many of you know about. In some cases, the data go back to the 1930s, the 1940s, and some they begin in the 1970s. In some cases, for some reason, I don't know what the person in Gallup-Roper was and we're no longer interested. So you'll see. Some of the opinion questions are well known, and I'm going to provide a summary at the end, giving you the year at which the median person agreed with the question. So the first three concerned women's competencies. Should a married woman work for pay? And that's what we have here. And what I think you should take away from this is just how similar the answers are by sex, except for the initial difference in the 1930s. And also the fact that there was a very large initial change, which, as I said, due to the stupidity of these people at Gallup and Roper, the question was simply not asked. I have some data for college group here is so tiny. Similarly, there's a question about whether the US would be better governed if women were more politically active. And similarly here, the differences by sex are very small, except for in the first wave of this survey. And once again, we're missing data for the critical period of the 1960s. And finally, here is a question that's been used by many people, which is, would you vote for a woman president? And this was expressed very well, I think, in that the question was asked, if a competent woman, I love that, if a competent woman ran for president, like an incompetent woman would run for, she president in your party, in the party you would vote for, would you vote for her? You know, because people might think, oh, she's not running in my party, so I'm not going to vote for her. And these are the results, and it is pretty astounding how high these fractions become in the late 1960s, 1970s, particularly for the younger women, and how close these are by sex. Now, the next three concern whether women should be granted more equality. Should women be granted an equal role in business, industry, and government? And here we should be struck by the somewhat higher fraction of women agreeing with this than men, and by the generally low level of agreement until around the 1990s. What is your warmth for? And the question I find quite interesting, that it was phrased as, what is your warmth for the women's liberation movement? And then at some point, they took out the word liberation and it was just the women's movement. But I would have thought that using the word liberation would have made it sound like it was a far more left-wing movement. And what's interesting here, of course, is that particularly for the younger group, women have a much higher degree of approval with this question. But that approval by and large is nothing like it is for women's competencies. And finally here, so this is sort of what do you think of the movement? But there are also questions feminists. Now, to many of us, The word simply means, do you believe in the equality between men and women? But the word has many different meanings to every single person. And the answer here is that no one is a feminist, not even women. Okay. And some of the dotted lines are because women are asked the question in some years and men are not asked the question in some years. This comes from Gallup. There are also ANES questions about your warmth toward the concept of feminism. There's more warmth to the concept of feminism than there is about I wanted personal identity. And that's what this is. Okay. So now we still have a bit of time, and I was going to say here, and then we can talk about it. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm going to summarize this material by giving the year in which the majority of a group by age and sex. Remember here I have, this is very simple. I only have 4 groups. By age and sex agreed with the question. And so we have the questions, are you a feminist? Well, let's start from the bottom. Is work for pay okay if you have a husband who could support you? Should women be more politically active? Would you vote for a female president if she could make coffee? Would you grant women an equal role? What do you think about strengthening women's status? What do you think about the women's lib movement? And are you a feminist? Okay, now, so I'm going to put a little point. We have chickens are the older group. Remember, those are the 35 to 64-year-olds, and chicks are the younger group, and blue is male and orange is female. So this is how it works. Okay. So this means that 50% of the older men agreed with this statement by 1957. And this means that 50% of the younger men agreed with the statement by around 1949. And this means that about 50% of the younger females agreed with the statement by 1945. And coming up from the rear are the older women who agree with the statement, 50% by 1951. Everybody understand? Okay, so then we put them in. Women agreed that women were competent, were capable, as we saw before, fairly early. And this sort of brings out that it's both men and women. So it's about equal for men and women, and it's fairly early. In contrast, the year the majority of Americans agreed to give women more rights is much later. Similarly, for the year they agreed with the principles of women's rights groups, and their chief tenet, feminism, never exceeds 50. There's only one of the chickens, or I think it's the orange chicks, agree with it early. Okay. So finally, what I want to do is examine 2 of these questions in more detail. What we couldn't see in this graph is that women So, for example, on the question of giving women an equal role, And that's the question on the left here. What we couldn't see in the graph is that women were greatly divided. So the means across all years, and here I'm aggregating from 1972 to 2008, the means across all years here, they're very similar. 47% of women and 44% of men across all these years properly weighted, hopefully properly weighted, which is a difference of about 3 percentage points. However, if I define traditional women and non-traditional women, and the most important thing is being a college graduate or not being a college graduate, and one of them is or not, okay? And you could just, so these are just simple tabs, simple means, conditional on each of these. And what you can see is that the differences widen enormously for women. So traditional women are 31% in favor of this question, but the non-traditional women are 72%. So rather than a difference, the difference here is 41 percentage points. But for the men, the differences between the traditional and the non-traditional is much, much smaller. So women, as I was pointing out in the framework, were vastly different. It turns out that it's probably the case that if I use these data and look over time, these differences anything, they become less over time. Similarly, for the women's movement question, the difference is 7 percentage points between men and women. Between the traditional and the non-traditional women, the differences are 38 percentage points, but for the men is 17 percentage points. So women become extremely divided during this period, perhaps less later on in the period, but very divided in this period, men less so. Okay, so let me end and we can have questions. So I've spoken about the change in women's rights during the past century, really sort of the past 60 years. Even though it's been hard to show convincingly that the expansion of rights led to change, and it's hard to believe that attitudes didn't change because of these altered rights. It's likely that the actions of the traditionalists more recently have diminished the ability of women to fully use their rights by preventing the funding for universal pre-K and preventing the funding for paid parental leave. But it's also hard for me to believe that we would all be in this room today had our rights remained as they were in 1962. Thanks.